All right. Hey guys. In our lecture today, we're going to finish up George Washington's presidency. Remember, he did not want to be there. Even at the start in 17 89 when he's sworn into office as our first president, he really wanted to be back at Mount Vernon in Virginia, running his estate, retiring, getting some rest after all those years with the Continental Army and being a soldier and keeping the new nation together and presiding over the Constitutional Convention. But he stayed in because of the fractures that were developing in his own cabinet. Washington was very conscious of the fact that he did not want to leave the new nation worse off than when he had started, with these new political party systems forming. And remember, this was due to the fracture in his cabinet between Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, really, who was his Treasury Secretary. These two men, with their differing opinions, are going to basically form the first political party system. Now, when we talk about party systems, keep in mind a political party is when you have a group of people with their own vision of how a government should be run and what is best for the country. It's not like one side is right and the other's wrong. It's just different views on how to have a good country and a good government. Now, Hamilton's views are those of the Federalist Party. He's kind of like one of the leaders of the Federalist Party. They'd formed originally, kind of gathering around supporting the Constitution. They wanted a stronger central government than what we'd had under the Articles of Confederation. They're supported mainly by the well-educated, the elite. They're supported by the wealthy merchants and bankers, and primarily are going to represent the interest of the cities and those more on the eastern coast of the nation. The Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Republicans under Thomas Jefferson, and remember also James Madison, the father of the Constitution, they are going to be more in line with representing the common people, more in line with those out in the rural or country places, out in the western frontiers, for instance. These are the people who don't trust the bankers and the merchants, the rich and the elite. These are the more average folk. They also are going to be divided, these two political parties, in who in foreign policy they support. So for instance, the Federalists under Alexander Hamilton, they're more in line with Britain. I know we just broke away from Britain in the Revolutionary War, but that is the country that we have the most ties to commercially, which means business, but also ties in culture, in the language we speak, in the values that we uphold, English common law, right? Now, for the Democratic Republicans, they're much more in line with France. And we'll see this, especially under Washington's second term, as the French Revolution gets more underway, that more than anything else will cement and form these two political party systems as the Democratic Republicans more and more take up the cause of the French Revolution. And they support that because, remember, France had assisted us in our own revolution. We would not be the United States were it not for France. And when their revolution begins, they're basically taking a lot of these same grievances and Enlightenment ideas that had fomented our revolution. That's what had, basically created their revolution. We inspired them. So there's those differences. You also have interpretations of the Constitution when you're contrasting these two first political party systems. Two first political parties. Under the Federalist and Alexander Hamilton, they're much more of a loose construction view of the Constitution, which remember means that because of the elastic clause under Article 1 in the legislative branch, they believe that even though a power might not be specifically written in the Constitution that's given to our government, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So for instance, these are implied powers. The elastic clause says that Congress shall have all power necessary and proper to make the laws of the land. Well, think about Hamilton's financial plan, okay? Congress in the Constitution is given the power to tax, and it's given the power to create a budget and to wage war, to declare war. Now, in order to collect taxes, you have to have an apparatus in place to collect them and a place to put that revenue, to put that money. You need a bank. Yet nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about the federal government creating a bank. So this is that loose construction view. It's an implied power. Like, it's not there, but it should be based on what else was said, right? So that's where Hamilton argues basically that in order for the government to do what it's supposed to do in collecting taxes, the government also has the power to make a bank, even though that's not specifically mentioned. So that's the loose construction view. On the Democratic Republican side, the strict constructionist view, upheld by like Jefferson and Madison, who wrote a big chunk of the Constitution with his Virginia plan, that says, not so fast, Mr. Hamilton. If it doesn't say it in the Constitution, you can't do it. So that is a very like literal interpretation, no implied power view. That's the strict view. On domestic policy, basically, Hamilton's financial plan is what the Federalists support, and the Democratic Republicans, they are against his financial plan. That was another thing that really divided these two groups and helped to form these political parties. And like I said, foreign policy, the Federalists favor the British, the Democratic Republicans, they favor the French. So Washington stays on for another 4 years. His inaugural address was super short. It was literally one paragraph where he said, I am now adhering to my constitutional duties to have an oath of office. Y'all dragged me into this. I guess I'm back for 4 more years. Congratulations. Like, he wants to be done, the poor man. But we could not lose him at this moment. Our country is so fragile. And in 1789, that's when Washington was first sworn in his first term. That was when the French Revolution began. And then it started to get really ugly by like 1792, 1793, right when Washington was, contemplating a second term and being sworn in for his second term in office. Remember, a presidential term is how long? It's 4 years. Okay. So the French Revolution, this is where you have the French citizens rise up against their monarchy. This was due to a variety of factors, like I've mentioned, Enlightenment ideas about the people and equality. In fact, the catchphrase for the French Revolution is liberté, égalité, fraternité, which means, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. But it's also inspired by the financial situation in France. I'm not going to go in super in depth in the French Revolution, because if you've had AP World History, I'm sure you went into it. But remember that the third estate, the poor people, they're paying these taxes. There have been a series of debts. They have no money. They are starving. They are poor. They're beyond poor. And the French government under King Louis XVI and his beautiful, Prussian wife, Marie Antoinette, they have been spending a lot of money on wars. In fact, remember France assisted the United States after the Battle of Saratoga in the American Revolution, and they paid a lot of money. Now, they were also, that was for their own benefit. They were fighting the British at the time, had a common enemy with us. But they spent a lot of money assisting the United States in our American Revolution, going heavily into debt. They had other wars as well. So they're spending all this money and going into debt and taxing the common people, the third estate, very heavily. So this is why the French Revolution occurs, and it's inspired by our Enlightenment ideas about the people having the right to topple a government if it's not upholding those unalienable rights. Remember that governments exist by the will of the people, and if any government becomes destructive of those ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, get rid of it, and to create a new government. Those are the very words, remember, in that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It was none other than Thomas Jefferson who wrote those words, and in fact, he is a huge supporter of the French Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette, that young French revolutionary that came to Washington and helped us greatly during the American Revolution. He is a key figure in this French Revolution, and Jefferson and Lafayette kind of team up, and they're going to draft this very important document for the French Revolution called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So Jefferson helped Lafayette write that. And it basically spelled out a lot of the common causes that America and France had, wanting to get rid of a tyrannical, monarchical government that was terrorizing the people and unfairly taxing them and not protecting their fundamental natural rights, those unalienable rights. So all this sounds really good, but like I said, it does get very ugly. The people take over, and there's not much organization in place. So it's got some of the elements of our revolution, but then it just gets really out of hand. And Washington was monitoring the situation very carefully as all this progressed, and getting these reports. He wants to have nothing to do with this, especially after 1792, 1793, because that's when the reign of terror began. And remember, there's this new doctor who has these ideas about a more humane way to execute people. Now, most of these thousands of people that were killed by la guillotine, this new device that would quickly chop off a person's head, these were dissenters, people who disagreed with the new Committee of Public Safety and Maximilien Robespierre, who was like a dictator, basically, that had taken over after they chopped off King Louis XVI's head. And so basically, you don't agree with the government, you get killed. That's not something that America really wants to be associated with. So Washington is going to try to keep us away from this. Meanwhile, Jefferson's saying, no, these people are like us. They're trying to do what we did. We should help them. Remember, they helped us. France was right there helping us to become our own nation and get our independence from Britain. So this is going to be a huge dividing point. Like I said, it helps divide Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans from Hamilton and the Federalists. And Hamilton, by this point in time, by Washington's second term especially, is really Washington's main right-hand man. Hamilton has replaced Madison, and Washington is going to defer. He's going to listen to Hamilton on most matters. So Washington, under Hamilton's strong advice, declares officially that America will be neutral when it comes to the French Revolution. In France, by the way, the French revolutionary governments, there's going to be many of them, they basically are going to be at war with all of Europe, against Britain, against Spain, against all the monarchies of Europe. Because remember, what they did poses a direct threat to every other monarchy in Europe. So France is fighting all of these wars. And France would really, really like to see the new country of the United States support them. But Washington's like, nah, we're going to be neutral. Now, Thomas Jefferson, he is very upset. He's very consternated that Washington would declare neutrality so publicly. Now, officially, yeah, Jefferson agrees that America, like wholeheartedly jumping into a war right now against all of the European powers, with only this revolutionary, chaotic French apparatus to assist us, would be a bad idea. He acknowledges that that would be stupid. We don't want to just jump into this. But he says officially declaring neutrality kind of closes some doors. You know, maybe there would be some kind of backroom ways that America could assist the French, and Washington just closed any hope we could have of assisting them by declaring our neutrality so publicly. And he also, along with Madison, argues that Washington doesn't have the authority to do this. This is something that Congress should have the authority to do. But regardless, Washington, with some tacit support from Congress, declares officially our neutrality when it comes to the wars in Europe and supporting the French. We're not going to help. Now, it's in 1793, just a few months after Washington does this, that the new French revolutionary government sends over their emissary to the United States, their ambassador. His name was Edmond Genet. And this will be known as the Genet Affair or the Citizen Genet Affair. Genet comes to South Carolina right when Washington was at a funeral back in Virginia in Mount Vernon. Washington's on his way back to Philadelphia, where the new provisional government, our capital was located as Washington, D.C. was being built. And Genet arrives in South Carolina, and instead of heading up to Philadelphia to meet Washington and get his official accommodations, his accreditation, say hi to the president and get his official paperwork done, he just kind of lingers in South Carolina, basically attending a lot of parties and stirring things up big time. Genet is like, "Oh, Americans, you have helped us. Now, we have helped you in the American Revolution. Now you help us, and liberté, égalité, fraternité." He's talking this big talk and getting everybody all excited, and people are rah, 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 France, we got you, France, we got you back. And meanwhile, he's ignoring George Washington's direct orders to come to Philadelphia right now, sir, and let's have a talk. So he's stirring up all this trouble. And what he's actually doing officially, is he's going to commission American private ships, private vessels, privately owned, into the French Navy to fight France's war against its European enemies. Oh, that's not very neutral. He's also gathering a provisional army from American citizens to go down to Florida to fight some of Britain's Spanish allies down there. So this is very not good for our neutrality. And by the way, why does Washington want to be neutral? Remember, America's a very young country. We can't afford to get in a war right now. We wouldn't be able to survive it. We're too weak at this moment. The only course of survival for us is to stay out. But Genet is making that very, very difficult. And when some of those privateering vessels that Genet had commissioned into the French Navy actually capture and then basically recommission British ships under the French Navy. So he used American ships to capture British ships. That puts us in direct conflict with Britain. Oh no, we just finished the American Revolution, and now we're basically doing acts of war against Britain with this French guy, basically putting us in this impossible situation. So Washington denounces Genet, and this is one of the only times actually that his cabinet was in complete agreement. Both Alexander Hamilton and even Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, they both wholeheartedly agreed that this guy had crossed a line. Genet had gone too far, and they actually together in a rare collaboration write up this scathing letter to Genet telling him, denouncing his actions, telling him to get his butt to Philadelphia and to comport yourself, sir. Genet is protesting and ignoring this. He's calling us traitors. He says that the Treaty of Alliance that America had signed in 1777 with France is still applicable. We had said that we would hold an alliance with France forever, and he says, well, you can't go back on that now. Now, Hamilton and Washington and the cabinet, they all argue, yes, we can, because the government of France that we signed that alliance with no longer exists. You cut its head off when you chopped off King Louis XVI's head. By the way, Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. She also had her head cut off. Now, she was also a very clueless Habsburg princess when she said, let them eat cake. Maybe she didn't actually mean that in the mean, rude, oh, I'm a rich girl and I'm eating cake while peasants are starving way. Maybe she meant that in oh, why can't they have cake like I have cake every day, because she was clueless. But anyway, they all get their heads chopped off. That's the French Revolution. Heads are rolling, blood's in the streets of Paris. And they make a good argument to Genet that, hey, this treaty of alliance with France is null and void because that government is dead. You killed it. So Genet doesn't have any legs to stand on. And then he gets a letter back home from France that the government that had sent him is no longer in power. There's a new revolutionary government in power. That happens frequently during the French Revolution. And they are recalling citizen Edmond Genet to hold trial in Paris, which is basically saying that he's going to go on trial and he's going to have his head cut off on the guillotine. So Genet begs Washington. This is ironic, right? He was just calling Washington weak and saying Washington was a coward for not wanting to help the French. And now he's begging George Washington, our president, to please grant him asylum, grant him safety so that he doesn't have to go back to France and get his head cut off. And Washington, being the magnanimous, reasoned, logical, leader that he is, he agrees. He says, yeah, I'll give you asylum. And Edmund Genet actually spends the rest of his life, lives it out in the United States in peace, becoming a gentleman farmer. I believe he marries the daughter of one of our vice presidents, George Clinton. So he lives the ripe old age of like 70 something. But meanwhile, the political, like, foreign policy situation is fraught. It's not looking very good. You have all these problems with France that Washington is trying to delicately weave through, which has caused a major rift in his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson is going to resign his post as Secretary of State over all of these problems we're having with France, because Jefferson truly believes in the ideals of the French Revolution. And maybe that's where, there's immense respect that Washington holds for Jefferson. And I think Jefferson truly loved George Washington as well, but he thought that Washington was being controlled by Hamilton by this point. And Jefferson is an idealist. He likes to see the beauty of things, what the could be, the potential. Washington is much more of a pragmatist, much more of a realist, the real politic that we have today. Like, hey, in an ideal world, that's great, but we got to live with what we have. That's more of Washington's outlook. And I think for most of his presidency, even before Jefferson had resigned, Washington holds his own counsel when it comes to foreign policy. He is his own Secretary of State, basically. So there's those problems with France, with the revolution happening and our neutrality. And then there's also problems with Britain, okay? In the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ended the American Revolution, Britain had agreed to remove its soldiers from those forts located in the Northwest Territory and the Great Lakes region, like Fort Mickleback in Detroit and Fort Oswego and some of the others. They had yet to do that. They were not adhering to the terms set out by the treaty. Now, why did they ignore this? Britain argued that they were keeping their soldiers there because we had failed to keep our end of the bargain in the Treaty of Paris. And that was that we would not confiscate loyalist properties. Remember, loyalists were those that continued to support Britain and the crown during the American Revolution, American colonists that supported Britain. We were taking over their properties, which was one of the terms that we were not supposed to be doing under the treaty. We also had a lot of debt, a lot of actually Southern, like Virginia plantation owners. They owed a lot of British banks a lot of money that they had yet to pay back. And so Britain was kind of keeping its soldiers in the Northwest Territory and in the Great Lakes, kind of as insurance that America would uphold its promises to repay its debts from its private citizens and to stop confiscating loyalist properties. So there's all of that going on with Britain. At the same time, because of the war Britain is fighting with France in Europe, they are in desperate need of more British soldiers and more British sailors for their giant navy. Remember, Britannia rules the seas. They have this immense navy, but they've been fighting wars, like war after war after war. In the 16 and 1700s, they're running really short on sailors. Where are they going to get these sailors from? Well, that brings us to this thing called impressment. Impressment is when a country basically kidnaps or steals sailors from other nation ships and forces them to be in their navy. So Britain is basically taking over American ships or just boarding them, grabbing American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. That kidnapping of sailors, that is impressment. So that is going on, and that's like a huge act of war. That is not cool. So we're having some major beef with Britain. You also have the trade situation. Remember how lucrative and rich those Caribbean West Indies islands are, like Barbados, that Britain owns. Well, because of our neutrality and these problems that we're having with repaying debts and these soldiers in the Northwest Territory and all this other stuff, um, Britain had kind of closed off trade from America to the West Indies, to those British West Indies colonies. So we were not being able to get a lot of like the rum, the sugar, those other things that are very profitable there. They closed off the trade to punish us. And then the last point of conflict with the British that we're experiencing is that they're still arming those Native Americans in the Northwest Territories, which, if you'll recall right here, had been one of our reasons why we had our first Indian War, the Northwest Indian Wars with Little Turtle, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. That was because the British were assisting in arming Native Americans, holding those forts still in that territory. So what's going to happen because of all of these conflicts with Britain that we're having is that Washington is going to send over one of his most trusted advisors, John Jay, who, by the way, was the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's going to send him over to Britain, to London, to negotiate a treaty to work out these problems. And the resulting treaty, which, by the way, Jay was heavily consulted with Hamilton, so a lot of this is Hamilton's pushing, is going to be called the Jay Treaty or Jay's Treaty. It's very favorable to the British. And for that reason, the Jay Treaty is going to be incredibly unpopular with Jefferson, Madison, and their party, the Democratic Republicans. The Jay Treaty, it negotiated that the British would leave their forts in the Northwest Territory. It helped to try to shore up the border between Canada and the Great Lakes region. It also affirmed that Britain should not be arming the Native Americans of the region. It affirmed the southern border with Florida. It also affirmed that Britain would hopefully stop its policy of impressment. But on most of these things, we're not going to see Britain really change its tactics. They, just like in the Treaty of Paris, they say they'll do these things, but we don't see a big shift in them actually following through. However, I will say for the Jay Treaty, one of the big positives is that it does give us at least 10 years of peace with Britain. Now, in 1812, that's when the War of 1812 to 1815 is going to start. In 1806, because the Jay Treaty was negotiated in 1795, so in 1806, this is 11 years later, Jefferson is president, and when they go to renegotiate the treaty, because it was only in place for 10 years, they can't work out a renegotiated treaty. And that's going to lead us right into the War of 1812. But because it gave us at least a decade of peace, that's one decade, 10 years for America to grow, to secure its borders, to basically get a little bit stronger before we end up having to go against Britain again. And that could have been basically something that saved us. Who knows if in the mid 1790s, if we would have been able to take another war with Britain at that moment. So that's one of the positives of the Jay Treaty. But largely, it was seen at the time as incredibly negative. It was seen as a betrayal by the Democratic Republicans towards the French, because it was so heavily favoring the British. In fact, it gave Britain favored nation status when it came to Britain. They allowed us to start trading again with their British West Indies colonies, but now they're like the main ones we're trading with. And if we tried to trade with other nations, then they would punish us. Well, that sounds exactly like mercantilism. That sounds exactly like we're back to being a colony of the British. And that's what Thomas Jefferson says. He's like, we just took giant steps backward, guys. How is this any different from, before when we were a colony of Britain? So that is the Jay Treaty. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney is going to be having a treaty with the Spanish. Now, recall kind of what had happened here. After the French and Indian War, Britain had obtained Florida, and France had given the Louisiana Territory, we call it, over to the Spanish. And then after the American Revolution, during the Treaty of Paris in 1783, what happened is that Britain is going to give back what they call East Florida to the Spanish. Spain also controlled West Florida, which is this bottom Gulf Coast area you can see on the map below Alabama and Mississippi here and parts of Louisiana. That is also controlled by the Spanish, including where New Orleans is, which New Orleans is an incredibly valuable, incredibly strategically, geographically important port city. It basically gives this entire region of the Mississippi the ability to trade internationally. That's where all of the goods produced here, they're going to ship down the Mississippi River. They come out in New Orleans and they can go anywhere in the world. That is a very important place. And this Louisiana territory in a secret deal was given back to the French just a few years before they're going to sell it to us with Napoleon. Napoleon is the revolutionary figure that emerges from the French Revolution. He's going to become like a dictator, then an emperor in France and all of that. So meanwhile, what's going on is that the Spanish are causing some problems for this trade. They have control of New Orleans and they are requiring taxes. And when they're not being paid, they're closing off the trade. So they're hampering this entire region's commercial activity. There's also a lot of border disputes with Native Americans and with the British here with Florida. So Pinckney's treaty is going to establish the southern border with Spain at the 31st parallel. And it's also going to guarantee that Americans have the right to navigation of the Mississippi, that we can basically do trade through New Orleans unhampered. So that was very valuable, again, for the Mississippi region. That's just pretty huge. Okay, remember under Hamilton's financial plan, so we're turning to domestic affairs now to wrap up Washington. Remember under Hamilton's financial plan that America, the new national government is going to assume all the states' debts from the Revolutionary War. So we're going to accrue a massive debt. Why are we going to do that? Well, we want to up our credit score so we can get loans and we can, function as a big nation should to basically establish our credit. Now, to pay off our debts, we need to make money. There were two ways Hamilton had in his plan for how America would earn some money to pay off this massive debt that we just gained. The first way was through tariffs, okay? And remember, that's going to anger a lot of our southern planters because they're the main ones exporting raw materials, like eventually cotton, but also indigo and tobacco and et cetera. Meanwhile, the North, they're being protected by these tariffs because that's where a lot of these new industries are going to be forming. And eventually factories will form there. Manufacturing will be there. So tariffs, that's a tax on traded goods. That was one way to have the new country earn money. The other way for the new country to earn money was going to be through a tax on liquor. And that especially was going to be on whiskey because that was the main liquor distilled in America at this time, especially by Western farmers who, of course, feel like they're being singled out unfairly. Why should they have to subsidize this debt that the national government is taking on? And this is primarily going to focus on backwoods, frontier, Western farmers in the state of Pennsylvania. If this sounds familiar, yes, remember Shays' Rebellion? That was like these Western backwoods farmers over in Western Massachusetts. Okay, so this is in Pennsylvania, but very similar people experiencing a kind of similar situation. So they are going to adopt a lot of the rhetoric of the American Revolution. They are going to protest that their rights are being ignored, that they're being taxed unfairly, and they're going to start to refuse to pay their taxes. They're also going to start tarring and feathering tax collectors and government officials. And they basically will lead a march on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with 7,000 Whiskey Rebellion protesters in 1791 to burn the city to the ground in protest of this tax. Now, a few more reasons why these guys would be so upset by a whiskey tax. Because of the shortage of cash at this time. And remember that like the continental dollars that were issued during the war, that were printed off during the American Revolution, had become almost completely worthless. They'd lost all value because they'd just been printed off with nothing to back them. That led to inflation. So money was worthless, and there wasn't a lot of that species money to be had. So what a lot of these Western farmers used for their money was whiskey. They'd take their grain, they would distill it into this liquor, and then they would use that to trade for items, because whiskey would obviously last a lot longer than the wheat would. And they could also ship it over to the East and make money that way because, you know, it's in these crates, it's in these bottles, it can last a long time versus their crops, their wheat. So it was actually used as currency by a lot of these farmers. Another thing that really angered them about the whiskey tax, they feel like they're being singled out, was that these Western farmers, you know, on their individual family farms, they can't make as much whiskey as the big distilleries, the big companies back on the East Coast. And the tax said that you could either pay a flat fee for your tax when you're paying it, or you could pay by the bottle. Now, these backwoods farmers in the Western frontier in Pennsylvania, they can't afford the flat fee because they have no money. Remember, they're using their whiskey as their money. So they have to pay by the bottle, which actually hurts them more. They're having to pay more than they should because they don't have the cash. So there were a lot of justifiable reasons these guys had for revolting. 7,000 of them go to Pittsburgh, intent on burning the city down. And this is where Washington steps up, because remember, George Washington is president during this. Him and Alexander Hamilton are actually going to lead an army. And this is the first and only time that a sitting United States president has ever led an army into battle. And Washington doesn't go the whole way, and he actually had other generals in charge of like running the military. But it was very impressive marching through Philadelphia on his way to go meet his army. George Washington, president of the United States, on a, here's the picture, on a white horse, you know, with Alexander Hamilton right behind him, marching off to stop these rebels, basically. Now, Jefferson, who's retired from Secretary of State back at his plantation in Monticello now, and Madison, they are very, again, kind of skeptical, kind of upset at the precedent that Washington and Hamilton are setting here. They say, hey, these guys have a constitutional right under the First Amendment. Madison's like, I wrote that, I wrote the Bill of Rights, to protest. Now, Washington argues, yes, but that means to protest peacefully and in a constructive manner, and burning down the city and destroying people's properties, that is not their right under the First Amendment to protest and assemble and all that. So there is, again, some dividing happening over this, but Washington and his military, they outnumber the rebels, the whiskey protesters, 2-1. And very quickly, when the rebels see this giant force coming at them, heavily armed with George Washington leading them, they disperse. Only a few are hung, and that's the end of the rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, very quickly over. But what it showed was that the federal government, now under the Constitution, is a lot stronger than the government had been under the Articles. There's a direct comparison to be made here between the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s and Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s. Okay, and the difference was that our central government under the Constitution can take care of business. that it has the power and the authority to marshal an army and to establish law and order, where the Articles of Confederation were too weak to do that, as we saw with Shays. And there's some historians that kind of think that maybe Hamilton, being as diabolical and as intelligent and cunning as he was, maybe he foresaw this with his whiskey tax. And then maybe that was one of the reasons it was a specific part of his financial plan, because he wanted to make an example of these farmers and basically show the power of the central government, and in so doing, give the central government under the Constitution even more authority so that it would have the power to establish this law and order throughout the new nation. So again, Whiskey Rebellion, the new government, the Constitution, it's strong. It has the ability to put down these little rebellions and keep our country together. Well, all good things must come to an end. George Washington, he's again being encouraged by everybody to run for a third term, because at this moment, there is no 22nd Amendment. That's the amendment that will establish the two-term limit for presidents. Washington, being the first president, he could have ran again and again and again, but he chooses to step down after his second term to finally retire, as he had wanted to the whole time. And he begins very early drafting his farewell address. Now, most people, when you hear the word address, you think, well, this is a speech that Washington's going to give right before he leaves office. You're mostly right, but he never spoke it out loud. Remember, this time there's like no television or internet or anything, so it's hard to get your message out to everybody unless you do it through the spoken word, or through the written word. So this is actually a letter that's going to be put into newspapers throughout the country for people to read. But I think Hamilton, who's the main one that helped to write it, kind of always envisioned that it would be spoken aloud. And actually, every year, it's a tradition in the United States Senate that at the start of their term, they basically will read Washington's farewell address, because it has a lot of valuable messages and values that Washington shared with the nation. It's as him imparting, his best advice for the new country. Washington will die from illness and from terrible doctor care in 1799. So this is 1797 when he's stepping down, and John Adams, his vice president, will be elected the new president. So this is just a few years before Washington's death. He's almost gone. He's wanting to retire. This address had first been started at the end of his first term, because remember, he won it out then, and Madison was actually the one to pen his early draft. Washington's going to take what Madison wrote, and then he's going to write up his own stuff. He's going to give it to Hamilton. They kind of exchange stuff back and forth. Hamilton will take his final draft and get some advice from John Jay. Remember, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the guy that negotiated the Jay Treaty with Britain. And then finally, Washington will do one last take. So this is what Washington wanted, but it's also heavily influenced by Alexander Hamilton. And the main thing it does is these points here, and you need to know them. Let's take a look. It extols the benefits of the federal government, and there's a direct quote from it. The unity of government is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. I think the biggest theme of his farewell address is unity, because Washington, like I said, he wants to leave the nation better than when he found it, and he's very, very concerned about the fractures, the divide that is occurring within his own government, his own cabinet, like between the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. So he's preaching unity, baby, unity, keep it together, keep this country together. I gave 45 years of my life. I am now reduced to an old man without teeth, with glasses so I can see, in service of this country, which we have built. Please, for God's sake, keep it together. So unity, preach it, Washington. He warns against the party system. Okay, again, with that unity, again, warning against the divide between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. He says it serves to distract the public councils, having these political parties, enfeeble the public administration, enfeeble to to make silly of the government, agitates, angers the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. That's very relatable to today, right? Kindles the animosity of one against another. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Look at lobbyists today. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subject to the policy and will of another. So yeah, he warns against political parties. He says, that maybe they have a place for giving the opposing minority view a voice, but they do more harm than good, Washington says. Stresses the importance of religion and morality. He says, where is the security of prosperity, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? It's interesting on this advice that Washington gives, because he's basically saying the way to avoid, the country fracturing and splitting apart, the way to keep our unity and move forward successfully is through having a well-informed, well-educated, moral society, and moral, having a good religious foundation. And I say it's interesting because Washington himself, his own religious beliefs are somewhat obscure. There's a famous painting that is not very accurate of him, praying at Valley Forge during the American Revolution. But Washington in practice kind of avoided organized church. He avoided organized faith in general, which led many to believe that he might have been a deist. That Enlightenment idea, reconciling logic and faith. But Washington acknowledges in his farewell address basically the need for people to have a moral compass, the need for us to be grounded, to have a good education, because the country is made up of the people, and the people themselves have to know what's going on, and they have to care and have to have the right guiding principle if this country is to succeed. The next point on his farewell address, on stable public credits. You can bet your bottom dollar that a lot of this was heavily influenced by Hamilton. Cherish public credit, avoid national debts. There has to be taxes, that no taxes can be devised which are not inconvenient and unpleasant. So he says, we might not like it, but we got to pay our taxes. We have to have revenue if the government's supposed to do stuff. We have to pay off our debts. We have to be fiscally responsible. So that section in particular is very heavily influenced by Hamilton and Hamilton's financial plan, which, remember, Washington, didn't really get in front of. Washington was president, but he let Hamilton basically completely have the run of everything financial, which you might say, well, that makes sense. Miss Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary. Yeah, but remember, when it came to foreign policy, Washington was all about controlling it. So yeah, that's the message. Avoid debt. Might not like taxes, America, but we have to pay them. Let's be fiscally responsible. Fiscally means like money related. Oops. Okay. Warns against permanent foreign alliances. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Who do you think he's talking about there? France. Mainly France. Also maybe Britain a little bit, but mostly France. And a lot of people, this is one of the big takeaways from Washington's farewell address. And the famous line that most people quote, to avoid foreign entanglements, wasn't actually spoken, or it was never spoken, but it wasn't actually part of the letter that Washington sends out to all these newspapers. That comes about later. But that's the sentiment, that America should not form any permanent alliances. And like I said, this is primarily geared towards France, toward the Treaty of Alliance we had with them from 1777, because that was causing all these problems with like Citizen Genet, now that the French Revolution was underway. And so he's not saying, and a lot of people say, well, this is Washington urging America to be isolated. This is the isolationist argument, like we'll see with the Monroe Doctrine, or later when we get to isolationism, like after World War I. They say, well, Washington said this in his farewell address. Not necessarily. Just because Washington says to avoid permanent foreign alliances doesn't mean he says to stay out of foreign affairs entirely, right? That's what isolationism is. No, instead, Washington is just saying, don't make them permanent. Okay, Washington believed that people could be trusted to have one another's back. You know, your friend can be trusted to sacrifice, you know, himself or herself for your own needs, but you can never trust a country to be that selfless, because countries act with their people's best interest at heart, and they can't sacrifice that for another nation. So countries cannot be trusted to always act in accordance with a permanent treaty. So just the permanent part really is what Washington had a problem with. But yeah, that is one of the big takeaways. Avoid foreign entanglements, and specifically what he means, avoid permanent foreign entanglements. And the last thing, an over-powerful military establishment. This is very interesting. It's kind of, it should bring direct parallels, direct comparison to the later president, former World War II General Dwight Eisenhower, who had been the supreme Allied commander of the Allied forces in World War II, the Americans, the British, and so on. Eisenhower, when he's president in the 50s, he gives his own farewell address, very much like Washington, where he warns of the military industrial complex, the idea that if we keep spending so much money and attention on the military, eventually it'll get so big and powerful, it'll take over the country. And here Washington is, as a general, as a military man, arguing the same thing. But remember, like the Newburgh Conspiracy, Washington is the American Cincinnatus, okay? He is always proving that he values his role as a citizen and America's role as a democracy led by citizens versus a military establishment. So he warns against the military becoming too powerful there. So that is Washington's farewell address. There's Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, Hillary Clinton's running mate in 2016, speaking about how the Senate gives that, they read that his Washington's address every year on the Senate chamber. And Washington goes home to Mount Vernon, where he will live the next couple years and then die a very sad, unfortunate death from the cold in 1799. So that is the end of Washington's presidency. Next time on Dragon Ball Z. Just kidding. I didn't like that show. I'm sorry. I know some of you probably, you love Goku, Gohan, all that stuff. Okay, whatever, but sorry. But next time we will talk about the presidency of John Adams and all the difficulties that poor Mr. Adams, his rotundancy, will have. Thank you guys. I'll talk to you later.